October 1944. A train rattled through the darkness of West Texas, carrying 73 Japanese prisoners across a landscape they could barely comprehend. Through barred windows, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto watched the endless expanse of scrubland blur past, convinced they were being transported to their execution. The terrain looked nothing like the America he'd studied in military intelligence briefings back in Tokyo. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men were about to witness would shatter every assumption they held about their enemy, leaving them questioning not just the outcome of the conflict, but the very foundation of everything they had been taught to believe. Lieutenant Yamamoto pressed his face against the cool glass as dawn broke over the Chihuahuan desert. Beside him, Corporal Kenji Nakamura whispered what they were all thinking. "We have left America," Nakamura said, his voice barely audible over the train's rhythm. "They are taking us to Mexico to dispose of us, where no one will ask questions." The logic seemed sound to men who had been prepared to die rather than surrender. They had been captured in the Marshall Islands after their garrison had held out for 63 days against overwhelming force. American propaganda had promised them torture and execution if they fell into enemy hands. Every man on that train had witnessed his own military's treatment of prisoners. They expected the same. Sergeant Hideki Tanaka, the senior enlisted man among them, had kept a secret diary since his capture 8 months earlier. On that October morning, he wrote with a stub of pencil on a scrap of paper he'd hidden in his boot. Day 247. The landscape has become alien. Mountains of red stone rise from the earth like the bones of dragons. No rice fields, no villages. No sign of human habitation. We travel deeper into this wasteland. I believe we go to our deaths, but I am no longer afraid. Death in this strange land may be merciful compared to the shame of returning home defeated. What none of these men knew was that they were approaching one of the most remote regions in the continental United States. Big Bend, Texas, stretched across more than 12,000 square kilometers of Chihuahuan desert, a landscape so harsh and beautiful that it seemed to exist outside the normal rules of geography. The camp that awaited them sat in the shadow of the Chisos Mountains, where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 43 degrees Celsius and winter nights could drop below freezing. The train slowed as it approached the camp, situated near the tiny settlement of Marathon, Texas. Population 463 people, most of whom had never seen the ocean, let alone traveled beyond Texas. The prisoners would outnumber the entire civilian population of the nearest town. As guards opened the train cars, the prisoners stepped out into air so dry it seemed to crack against their skin. Lieutenant Yamamoto took his first full view of the landscape and felt his knees weaken. Mountains the color of dried blood rose in every direction, their peaks sharp against a sky so vast and blue it hurt to look at. The desert stretched away in waves of beige and gold, broken only by sparse vegetation that looked nothing like any plant he'd ever seen. "This cannot be real," he murmured to himself. Captain William Henderson, the camp commander, watched the new arrivals with a mixture of curiosity and concern. At 42 years old, he'd been deemed too old for combat deployment, but too experienced to waste on stateside desk duty. Running a prisoner camp in the middle of nowhere hadn't been his first choice, but Henderson took his responsibilities seriously. He'd read every report about Japanese military culture, studied translations of their field manuals, and consulted with anthropologists about how to manage men raised in such a radically different society. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Robert Chen, stood beside him. Chen was Chinese-American, one of only 3 officers in the entire camp who spoke any Japanese. His presence had been controversial among some of the enlisted men, but Henderson had insisted on having translators who understood the cultural context, not just the words. "They think we're going to execute them," Chen said quietly. "Look at their faces. They're trying to show courage in their final moments." Henderson nodded. "Then let's show them something they don't expect." The first surprise came at roll call. Instead of being assigned to hard labor details immediately, the prisoners were led to a mess hall where hot food waited. Not prison slop, but actual prepared meals. Rice, yes, but also beef stew, fresh bread, coffee, and canned fruit. The portions were larger than anything they'd seen since before the conflict began. Private First Class Yoshiro Sato, who had been captured after surviving for 9 days on rainwater and raw fish, stared at his tray as if it might be poisoned. Around him, other men hesitated, looking to their officers for guidance. Lieutenant Yamamoto made the decision. "If this is our last meal, then we will eat it with dignity." He picked up his fork and began to eat. The food was real, the portions were generous, and when they asked for more rice, the American servers simply gave it to them. No questions asked, no reduction in tomorrow's rations as punishment. Sergeant Tanaka updated his diary that night. "They feed us like men, not animals. This troubles me more than cruelty would. I do not understand their purpose." The second shock came the following morning when they were issued work assignments. Instead of breaking rocks or digging ditches, they were told they would be working on the camp itself, building additional barracks, improving irrigation systems, and maintaining the grounds. More disturbingly, they would be paid. 10 cents per day, deposited in accounts they could access for purchasing items from the camp canteen. Corporal Nakamura laughed when he heard this, a sharp bark of disbelief. "They will pay us to build our own prison? This is madness." But the real transformation began when Lieutenant Yamamoto and a small group of officers were selected for a special work detail. Captain Henderson wanted to improve the camp's vegetable garden, and he'd learned that several of the prisoners had been farmers before the conflict. Would they be willing to share their expertise? Yamamoto agreed, partly out of curiosity, partly because he could not fathom what advantage the Americans hoped to gain from this obvious propaganda exercise. He expected to be led to a small plot of struggling plants and told to make them grow through force of will and Japanese discipline. Instead, he found himself standing at the edge of a 3-hectare plot of land with irrigation equipment that would have been the envy of any agricultural prefecture in Japan. The soil was poor, true, but the Americans had already invested considerable resources into improving it. They'd brought in compost, installed shade structures, and laid out experimental beds, testing different crops. Captain Henderson joined him, carrying a worn notebook. Through Lieutenant Chen's translation, he explained his vision. He wanted to create a sustainable garden that could feed not just the prisoners, but also contribute to the local community. Food rationing affected everyone, military and civilian alike. If they could make this desert bloom, it would benefit them all. "This is the part where you tell me that hard work will earn better treatment," Yamamoto said, his voice carefully neutral. "That cooperation will be rewarded." Henderson shook his head. "I'm telling you that I don't know how to grow vegetables in this climate, and you do. I'm asking for your help because I need it, not because I want to manipulate you." The honesty was so unexpected that Yamamoto found himself without a prepared response. In his entire military career, no superior officer had ever admitted ignorance or asked subordinates for genuine assistance. Orders were given. Obedience was expected. The concept of collaborative problem-solving between captor and captive existed nowhere in his understanding of military protocol. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Yamamoto and his detail began to genuinely care about the garden. They experimented with planting times, tested different varieties of seeds, and developed innovative irrigation techniques that accounted for the extreme temperature swings. When a flash flood threatened to wash away everything they'd built, American and Japanese workers alike rushed out in the middle of the night to save the crops, working side by side in the darkness with no guards, no guns, nothing but shared purpose. Sergeant Tanaka wrote, "Day 281. Today, I taught an American sergeant how to identify when tomatoes are ready for harvest. He thanked me and wrote down my instructions in his own notebook. His handwriting is terrible, but his attention to detail is admirable. I find myself hoping the plants survive. This feeling disturbs me. I should not care about anything in this place." But the greatest shock was yet to come. In late November, Captain Henderson announced that a small group of prisoners would be taken on an excursion into Big Bend National Park, which had been established just a few months earlier. The ostensible purpose was to identify wild edible plants and possibly collect seeds for the garden. The real purpose, though Henderson didn't say it aloud, was to show these men something they wouldn't believe unless they saw it with their own eyes. Lieutenant Yamamoto was selected, along with Sergeant Tanaka, Corporal Nakamura, and 7 others. They traveled in an open truck, escorted by only 2 guards who seemed more interested in pointing out geological features than watching for escape attempts. The journey took them deep into the park, along roads that were barely more than trails. They climbed higher into the Chisos Mountains, the air growing cooler and thinner. And then they crested a ridge and saw the full expanse of Big Bend spread below them. It was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. The Rio Grande carved its way through canyons of limestone and volcanic rock. Mountains rose in layers of purple and red and gold, stretching away to horizons that seemed impossibly distant. The sky arched overhead in a dome of blue so perfect it looked painted, and everywhere, despite the harsh conditions, life persisted. Cactus bloomed, hawks circled on thermal currents, desert bighorn sheep picked their way along cliff faces that should have been impassable. "This is still America?" Nakamura asked, his voice filled with wonder. One of the guards, a young corporal from Oklahoma named Jimmy Walsh, grinned. "Yes, sir. Beautiful, isn't it? Most Americans don't even know this place exists. My whole life I thought Texas was all cattle ranches and oil fields. Then they stationed me here, and I realized I'd never seen anything." They stopped at a viewpoint overlooking Santa Elena Canyon, where the Rio Grande had carved a chasm through 1,500 meters of limestone, creating walls that rose 150 meters straight up from the water. The scale was incomprehensible. The silence was profound. Sergeant Tanaka stood at the edge, looking down into the canyon, and felt something break loose inside his chest. For 8 months he had carried the weight of shame and defeat. He had survived when he should have died. He had surrendered when he should have fought to the last breath. Every moment of every day he had lived with the knowledge that he could never return home, could never face his family, could never restore the honor he had lost. But standing there, looking at something so vast and ancient and indifferent to human conflict, he felt the burden shift. This land had existed for millions of years before the first humans set foot in it. It would exist for millions more after all memory of this conflict had faded. Against that timescale, what did personal shame matter? What did national pride signify? Captain Henderson approached him quietly. "My grandfather fought in the First World War," Henderson said through Lieutenant Chen's translation. "When he came home, he couldn't talk about it, couldn't explain what he'd seen. But he used to take me hiking in the mountains of Colorado, and out there, away from everything, he could breathe again. He told me once that the mountains were older than all human foolishness. That helped him put things in perspective." Tanaka nodded slowly. "You brought us here to show us that America is more than cities and factories." Henderson shook his head. "I brought you here because this place is nobody's. It belongs to itself. And I thought maybe you needed to see that there's more to life than the conflict we're all trapped in." They spent 3 hours at the park, collecting seeds and sketching plants, but mostly just experiencing the landscape. On the return journey, the men were quiet, each lost in his own thoughts. That night, Tanaka wrote the longest entry in his diary. "I do not know what to think anymore. I was taught that Americans are soft, weak, focused only on material comfort and individual pleasure. But they built this camp in the middle of nowhere and staff it with men who treat us like human beings. I was taught that they have no appreciation for beauty, no spiritual depth. But they set aside this vast wilderness and protect it simply because it deserves to exist. I was taught that they would torture prisoners, work us to death, show no mercy. Instead, they feed us well, pay us for our labor, and take us on excursions to show us natural wonders. Either everything I was taught was lies, or these particular Americans are extraordinary exceptions. I do not know which possibility troubles me more." As winter arrived, the dynamic in the camp continued to evolve. The prisoners organized classes, teaching each other English and various skills. The Americans, in turn, offered classes in agriculture, mechanics, and other practical subjects. Baseball games broke out on Sunday afternoons, with mixed teams of guards and prisoners. The camp library, initially stocked with propaganda materials, gradually filled with books the prisoners actually wanted to read, requested and approved through a process that felt more like a library committee than military censorship. Lieutenant Yamamoto found himself in an increasingly strange position. He was still the senior Japanese officer in the camp, responsible for maintaining discipline and morale among his men. But he was also becoming something like a liaison, helping Captain Henderson understand cultural issues and mediating disputes. The line between prisoner and partner blurred a little more each day. In January 1945, the garden project reached a milestone. They harvested their first full crop of winter vegetables, cabbages, carrots, leafy greens, all thriving in carefully managed cold frames. The yield was substantial enough that Henderson arranged to donate the surplus to the local community in Marathon. The town's response was complicated. Some residents were grateful for fresh vegetables during wartime rationing. Others were deeply uncomfortable accepting food grown by enemy prisoners. A town meeting was called to discuss the matter. Henderson attended, bringing Lieutenant Yamamoto with him. It was the first time any of the prisoners had been allowed off the base, except for the Big Bend excursion. The meeting took place in the town hall, a modest building that served as church, school, and civic center. The room fell silent when Yamamoto entered. 73 sets of civilian eyes tracked his movement to a chair at the front of the room. He could feel their fear, their curiosity, their hatred. Someone in the back muttered something about Japs. Henderson's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The mayor, a leathery man in his 60s named Thomas Garrett, called the meeting to order. "Folks, we're here to discuss the vegetable donation from the camp. I've asked Captain Henderson and Lieutenant Yamamoto to attend, so we can hear directly from them about this project." Henderson stood and explained the garden in practical terms. The soil management, the irrigation systems, the careful selection of crops suited to the climate. He emphasized the collaborative nature of the work and the educational value for both his men and the prisoners. Then Yamamoto stood. Lieutenant Chen translated as he spoke in careful, formal Japanese. "I understand your hesitation to accept anything from us," Yamamoto said. "We are your enemies. Our nations are locked in a terrible conflict. Many of you have lost sons, brothers, husbands to this fighting. I do not expect you to forgive us or even to like us. But the vegetables are simply vegetables. They will rot if not eaten. We offer them not as propaganda, not as a trick, but because it is wasteful to destroy food when people are hungry." A woman in the third row stood up. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, and she wore a gold star pin on her lapel indicating she'd lost a son in the conflict. Her voice shook as she spoke. "My boy died in the Philippines. The last letter I got from him described what your people did to prisoners. So you'll forgive me if I don't want to eat food grown by Japanese hands." Yamamoto met her eyes. "I am sorry for your loss. Truly. I cannot speak for what happened in the Philippines or anywhere else. I can only speak for the men in our camp. We are farmers and fishermen, teachers and shopkeepers. We were called to fight in a conflict we did not choose. Many of us have also lost brothers, sons, friends. War makes monsters of everyone. But growing vegetables, that is simply human work." The silence that followed was heavy. Then an old rancher in the back stood up. Name was Hector Jimenez, and his family had worked this land for 4 generations. "My question is simpler," he said. "Are they good vegetables?" The tension broke slightly. A few people laughed. Henderson smiled. "They're excellent vegetables, best winter crop I've seen in this region." "Then I'll take some," Jimenez said. "Being a fool about war is one thing. Being a fool about good produce is another." The vote was close, but the town accepted the donation. Over the following months, it became routine. The camp garden supplied fresh vegetables to Marathon throughout the remainder of the conflict, and the relationship between town and camp gradually shifted from hostility to wary cooperation to something approaching mutual respect. But for Yamamoto, the real transformation came in April 1945, when news reached the camp that President Roosevelt had died. He expected celebration among the prisoners, or at least satisfaction that one of their chief enemies had fallen. Instead, he found his men genuinely shaken. Sergeant Tanaka said it best. "I knew him only as an enemy, as the face of American power, but the guards are grieving. They speak of him the way we speak of the emperor, with reverence and sorrow. I had not considered that our enemies might love their leaders the way we love ours." The camp observed a day of mourning. Henderson ordered the flag lowered to half-staff and cancelled all work details. In a gesture that surprised everyone, Yamamoto requested permission to hold a ceremony of respect. The prisoners assembled in formation, faced the flagpole, and stood in silence for 1 full minute while a bugler played taps. That evening, Corporal Walsh approached Yamamoto hesitantly. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you for the ceremony today. It meant a lot to the guys." "We may be enemies," Yamamoto replied, "but we are not without honor. Your leader has died. That deserves acknowledgement." "You know what's funny?" Walsh said. "I used to think of you all as just the enemy. Japs and slant eyes, whatever ugly words we used. But after today, after everything these past months, I'm having a hard time holding on to that. You're just guys, like us, stuck in the same bad situation." Yamamoto considered this, and when the conflict ends, when we are returned to our homes, what then? Walsh shrugged. "Honestly, sir, I don't know. I guess we go back to being enemies again, but maybe we'll remember that it doesn't have to be that way." In May, news of events in Europe reached the camp. The German forces had surrendered. Half the conflict was over. For the prisoners, this news was deeply troubling. If their European allies had fallen, what hope remained for their own nation? Yamamoto gathered his officers to discuss the situation. They met in the barracks after lights out, speaking in low voices. "We should prepare the men for the possibility of total defeat," Sergeant Tanaka said. "The Americans grow stronger every day. Their production capacity is beyond anything we imagined. I have seen the reports in the American newspapers. They build 1 aircraft carrier every month. Every month! Our entire Navy could not match their production in a single year." Corporal Nakamura shook his head. "The men will not accept surrender. Better to die here than return home in shame." "Is it shame, though?" Yamamoto asked quietly. "We did not choose this conflict. We fought with honor when we were called to fight. And now we are prisoners. Yes, but we are alive. Is survival itself not honorable?" "You have been corrupted by the Americans," Nakamura said bitterly. "They have fed you well and shown you pretty landscapes, and you have forgotten what we are." Yamamoto's voice hardened. "I have forgotten nothing, but I have learned something. I have learned that everything we were taught about our enemy was a lie. They are not weak. They are not cruel. They are not without culture or honor. And if we were lied to about them, what else might we have been lied to about?" The question hung in the air, dangerous and unanswerable. In August, the conflict ended with a suddenness that left everyone reeling. The atomic weapons, the Soviet entry, the Emperor's radio address accepting surrender. The prisoners heard the news from their guards and could barely process it. After years of being told that surrender was impossible, that they would fight to the last man, that death was preferable to defeat, the conflict simply stopped. The camp fell into a strange limbo. Technically, the conflict was over, but the prisoners could not simply be released. Repatriation would take months to organize. In the meantime, they remained in Big Bend, working in the garden, playing baseball, attending English classes, existing in a space between military prisoner and civilian refugee. Sergeant Tanaka wrote, "Day 703. The conflict is over. We have lost. I should feel despair, but instead I feel only relief. No more men will die, no more cities will burn, and I am alive to see it end. My father would say I have no honor, but Captain Henderson told me today that I am one of the finest gardeners he has ever known, and that when I return to Japan, I should use those skills to help rebuild. Perhaps that is a different kind of honor." In November, they received orders that repatriation would begin in January 1946. The prisoners would be transported to processing centers in California, then shipped across the Pacific to what remained of their homeland. Japan was devastated, occupied, transformed. They would be returning to a country they would barely recognize. On their last week in camp, Captain Henderson organized one final excursion to Big Bend. This time, nearly all the prisoners participated, traveling in a convoy of trucks up into the Chisos Mountains. They hiked to the South Rim, looking out over the desert that had been their home for more than a year. "I will miss this place," Lieutenant Yamamoto said to Henderson. "That is a strange thing to say about a prison, is it not?" Henderson smiled. "It was never just a prison, not really. It was a place where enemies learned to be human beings together. I'll miss it too, and I'll miss you all if I'm being honest. What will happen to the garden?" Henderson sighed. I don't know. They'll probably close the camp, reassign the personnel. The garden might survive if the locals keep it up, but without your expertise, I suspect it will struggle. Yamamoto reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn notebook. Inside were detailed drawings, planting schedules, irrigation diagrams, and notes in both Japanese and carefully phonetic English. "Give this to whoever takes over," he said. "Everything we learned, it is all here. Perhaps it will help." They stood together in silence, looking out over the vast landscape one last time. "You changed my mind about many things," Yamamoto said finally. "About America, about the conflict, about what is possible between people who are supposed to hate each other. I do not know if that is good or bad. But I will carry these lessons with me always." Henderson extended his hand. "I hope you find your way home safely, Lieutenant, and I hope your country rebuilds stronger and better than before." Yamamoto shook his hand, a gesture he'd learned from the Americans. "I hope the same for your country. And I hope that someday our nations will be at peace, not just because the conflict ended, but because we choose to see each other as human beings." In January 1946, the prisoners departed Camp Big Bend in the same trains that had brought them. But this time they knew where they were going. This time they understood that the alien landscape they'd feared was just another part of the vast and complicated world they inhabited. Sergeant Tanaka's last diary entry read, "Day 794. We leave tomorrow. I have lived in this strange place for more than a year, and it has transformed me in ways I am still discovering. I came here expecting death and found life. I came as an enemy and learned to be a friend. When I tell people back home about the mountains and deserts of Texas, they will not believe me. When I tell them that Americans treated us with dignity and respect, they will think I have been brainwashed. But I know the truth. I have seen it with my own eyes, tasted it in the vegetables we grew, felt it in the handshakes we exchanged. The conflict is over, but the real work of peace has just begun. I do not know if I will succeed in my own life, but I will try to carry forward what I learned in this place, that enemies can become friends, that hatred is not inevitable, that even in the midst of terrible things, human beings can choose compassion over cruelty." The camp closed in March 1946. The barracks were dismantled, the equipment sold off or transferred to other facilities. The garden lasted another 2 years before drought and neglect finally killed it. Today, almost nothing remains of Camp Big Bend, except some foundation stones and a small historical marker that few people ever read. But the story lived on in other ways. Lieutenant Yamamoto returned to Japan and became an agricultural consultant, helping to rebuild his nation's farming infrastructure. He never married, never spoke publicly about his time as a prisoner, but he kept Captain Henderson's notebook with him for the rest of his life. When he died in 1993, his niece found it among his possessions, along with a faded photograph of a group of men standing in front of mountains in a desert landscape. On the back, in precise handwriting, was written, "The place where I learned that enemies are just people who have not yet become friends." Sergeant Tanaka used his agricultural skills to help establish community gardens throughout occupied Japan, teaching returning soldiers and displaced civilians how to grow food in difficult conditions. He published a small book on desert agriculture in 1952, dedicating it to the Americans who showed me that dignity transcends national boundaries. He lived to be 91 years old, and his grandchildren still tell stories about the year he spent in a Texas desert, learning to grow tomatoes with men who should have been his enemies. Captain Henderson continued running prisoner camps until the end of 1946, then retired from the army and returned to his family's ranch in Colorado. He maintained correspondence with several of the former prisoners, writing letters in halting Japanese with the help of dictionaries and patient translators. In a letter to Yamamoto in 1955, he wrote, "I think often of our time in Big Bend. It was the best work I ever did in the military, not because we won anything or defeated anyone, but because we proved that even in the middle of conflict, basic human decency is possible. I hope you are well, old friend. I hope your garden grows." The lessons of Camp Big Bend were small and local, affecting only a handful of men in a remote corner of Texas. But those men carried those lessons forward, teaching their children and grandchildren that the world is more complicated than simple narratives of good and evil allow, that enemies can become friends, that landscapes can be bridges between cultures, that growing vegetables together is an act of profound hope in the midst of profound darkness. The conflict ended more than 80 years ago, but the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion continues. We still divide ourselves into us and them. We still prepare for conflicts. We still teach our children that some people are enemies who must be defeated. But we also still have the capacity to look across the divide and see human beings, to share food, to teach and learn, to stand together on a mountain ridge and marvel at beauty that belongs to no nation. The Japanese prisoners who thought they had left America when they arrived in Big Bend were wrong. They had simply arrived at a part of America that didn't fit their expectations. And in doing so, they discovered something more important than propaganda or military intelligence could ever teach them. They discovered that the world is larger, stranger, and more beautiful than any ideology can contain. That understanding, hard-won through months of living and working with former enemies, was perhaps the most valuable thing they brought home with them when the conflict finally ended. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.